Welcome to Just a Dude podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into the minds of those who shape our culture, politics, and understanding of the world. I'm your host, Nathan, and today we're embarking on a journey through the world of feminist journalism. We'll explore how stories are told, truths are uncovered, and how one person's voice can echo through the corridors of time, affecting change. Strap in for an enlightening conversation filled with insights that'll make you think twice about the narratives we consume. This is Just a Dude podcast, where every episode promises to be more than just talk. Joining me today is someone who doesn't just report on the world, she redefines it. Sarah Seltzer is not just any journalist. She's a feminist pioneer with a pen. Her work has graced the pages of the New York Times, Time Magazine, Jezebel, and Lilith Magazine, tackling everything from Hollywood's gender dynamics to the complexities of motherhood today. Sarah is also the author of The Singer Sisters, a novel that weaves together the tales of folk rock family across generations, exploring themes of legacy, music, and personal struggle. Today we'll unpack her journey, her journalism, and her fiction, diving into how she's managed to fuse personal narrative with cultural commentary. Welcome to the show, Sarah Seltzer. Sarah, welcome to the show. Would you like to let the audience know a little bit about yourself?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat. My name is Sarah Seltzer. I am a writer and editor. I live in New York City. I've lived here my entire life, except for college. And I work in all the mediums, basically, except for poetry. I write for and edit for the internet, so digital stuff. I write and edit for a print magazine called Lilith. So that's, print journalism. And I also write and edit fiction and book and criticism. So I'm kind of what you might call a generalist as a writer. So I do a little bit of everything.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
So Sarah, how did you get into writing and journalism overall?
It's a great question. I was always one of those kids. I mean, I loved, all kinds of learning when I was a kid, but I did gravitate towards books, towards reading, towards writing. And, I do sometimes think, because I'm a mom now too. I have two little boys, and I do sometimes think so much of it is everything, there's a Jane Austen quote that's everything nurtures what's strong already. You write a good poem and your teacher says, oh, wow, you wrote a great poem. You could be a poet. So I was encouraged by my teachers and parents to do that. And so whenever there was an opportunity to do a yearbook or a newspaper or a literary journal, I gravitated towards it as a kid. I used to sit in Barnes and Noble or Borders, which some of you might remember, and just read the Babysitter's Club or Nancy Drew or, whatever, Bobbsey Twins, Mysteries, the Sweet Valley Twins, whatever was popular. That's how I like to spend my time. Then when I got into high school, I joined the high school newspaper. My high school had a very serious newspaper, and it became my identity, and my abiding passion in high school was to work on the newspaper. And I was explaining to my son that I arranged my classes by the time I was a senior based on which teachers I knew respected and liked the newspaper and would give me a break and not make me take tests the morning after we had put the newspaper to bed.
Release,
you could just know by the time you were a senior, you knew which teachers were like, whoa, wow, she's the editor of the newspaper. Like, we should be nice, and which wouldn't give me a break. So I kind of, organized my life around that. And similarly in college, I did the newspaper and the magazine part of the newspaper. And I was a teacher and I did other stuff, but I always gravitated back towards writing. It's always been the easiest way I can express myself. And, I'm lucky enough that I've somewhat made a career out of it. But it is also just my happy place. I just really like to write. So,
yeah. And that's pretty good. I mean, the fact that you can turn a passion into a career, like you said, somewhat of a career, but even it's a career, right? You're a writer. And to be able to do that, so many people nowadays just don't have that option. And it's great to see folks like yourself to take a passion and turn it into their lifelong goal and not just work a job, quote unquote,
Right. And I've done that. I've worked, I've done, and I think that there's something to be said for you work your 9 to 5 and then you do your passion on your own time. There's that discussion that artists have all the time, right? Whether to do that, like to have the 9 to 5 so you have an income and you have a schedule and a routine, and then you can work on your own time, or to try to turn your passion into a career. And it's something that people go back and forth on, but I do feel really lucky. I feel really lucky.
It's so amazing that, you were able to do that and, to think and I'm just looking at some of your past experiences with different platforms like the New York Times, Time, Jezebel, like you said, Lilith Magazine, so how has your experience been with those? I mean, those are huge publications.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, it's funny when I started out doing journalism, it was the golden age of sort of independent. There were a lot of independent blogs and publications starting up, and some of my friends worked at those more alternative media places, and some of my friends worked in the mainstream media and had gotten the internships right out of college, and
Mhm.
everyone has ended up kind of gravitating towards the same careers. I mean, there's just not that many places to write left to
No, you're
edit.
right. You're right, there
So
isn't.
my connections to the New York Times and Time Magazine were just all former colleagues, and they were people that I'd worked with at smaller publications who ended up there. And they knew what I was interested in, and I knew what they might be looking for. So those editing processes were actually not as daunting as you would expect writing for a big outlet, because some of that wasn't always former colleagues, but I was recommended and introduced by former colleagues. So there was
Right.
a level of trust. And each publication is a little bit different. For me, that's really fun. I like trying to adjust my voice and my tone as a writer to what a publication like one of the women's magazines like Cosmopolitan or Glamour, which I used to write for their websites, would have a slightly different tone than the New
Sure.
York Times or a more literary publication. And it's kind of fun. To me, I treat it as like a challenge or a game.
Yeah, kinda like you get to play to different audiences, right? And really hone your skills towards those particular
Exactly.
folks. Yeah, that's pretty awesome because,
Yeah.
a lot of writers, I would say well, some of the writers I've talked to are definitely in one scope or one genre, and the fact that you could take your writing and, kind of curtail it towards a certain audience, that's pretty fun, actually. I think that's a pretty fun idea.
It is fun. It is fun. And for me, I mean, I think that I really see it as a skill and a trade, in that way, rather than that's sort of the career writer part of me, rather than the passion writer part of me, where like that's my skill.
Yeah,
So I can
exactly.
adjust it
Definitely
based
a
on
skill.
yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, some people feel differently about it. And I think a lot of it does depend on whether it's your career or whether you're doing, I teach
Yeah.
writing a lot, and I have some students who they have one story that they want to tell from their life, right? And
Yep.
it's really important for them to get it right. And so they're not necessarily going to want to just adjust their story for a different audience. Like they want to make sure that they have an editor and a publication that will really respect their voice, because
Yes.
they just have this one thing that happened to them that they want to write about. And I respect that too. That's just a different approach where, I'm kind of more workaday about it.
Yeah.
But, but I do see the whole range as, as an editor, as a teacher, and as a writer myself.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome because you do get that exposure to a bunch of different, items, and being a writer yourself, I have to think helps, you know, because you understand what they're going through. So you understand, or maybe you give some feedback, right? And say, hey, I love this. Maybe we'll do a little change here or, use some more creative processing. But I can only think that being a writer is going to help you be an editor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I try. I try.
And then, so you've written on a wide range of topics like feminism, culture, social issues. So when you write on those types of topics, what inspires you to write on those things?
So I always see being quote unquote a feminist journalist or a progressive journalist as it's not about pushing an agenda or trying to take things down from a feminist perspective. It's using that perspective to help us understand whatever we're writing about or and ourselves better. So if I'm writing a feminist critique of a movie, it's not like this movie is sexist and therefore it's terrible. Almost always it's like, here's the parts of the movie that I found really redeeming and interesting, and here's where maybe they got something wrong on gender, or maybe here's where they got
Yeah.
something right on gender. Like, isn't like what can that tell us about our society in general and the way we see gender roles? So I think that sometimes people think of like Tumblr feminism that's like, this is problematic, this is bad, which is, that's
Hmm.
fine. But as a journalist, it's more just the lens that I view things through.
Yeah.
Is it?
And
Yeah.
that's amazing for people, like myself, who obviously I am not a woman or a feminist because I'm a man, right? And so I might not
I think you can
understand
be
the
a
views.
male
Well,
feminist, but
yeah,
I know it's
but
a controversial
you know what
topic.
I mean? But the
Right, right.
views that I may not understand, I
Yeah,
can go through and read an article like yours and get some good feedback without, it's because it sounds like to me that you give a nice lens to it. You say, here's what they did right. Here's what they could have possibly done better. But you're not necessarily just going in there and shooting down everything because maybe there was one bad part to it.
exactly, exactly. And I got my start like a lot of writers my age and older got their start in a magazine that was called Bitch. It was started in the 90s in the Pacific Northwest, kind of in that whole kind of that alternative scene
Yeah.
that also gave birth to grunge music and all
Yep.
and Riot
That was
Girl.
my that
Yeah,
was definitely
totally.
my era for sure.
And what I loved so much about Pitch was it was called it was a feminist commentary on pop culture. But it was a magazine that truly loved pop culture, right? It was like
Yeah.
we're going to critique you because we love you. And I think that there's the internet has sort of soured a little bit of that.
Mhm.
But there's something about a magazine, which is why I love working at Lilith, which is also a magazine that's been around for a while.
Oh, yeah.
That it's a creation of love itself, like of the magazine. It's an object and it's curated, and so what I always loved about Bitch was it never made you feel bad for liking something that wasn't
Yeah, right.
didn't have the right politics. It was just more
Yeah.
interrogating why does I wrote pieces for them that was like about Twilight. I wrote about Twilight. I wrote about the Hunger Games. I wrote about all these things that were really popular. It was like,
Yeah.
why does this have this hold on me, even though I recognize that some of the politics are weird
Mhm.
and not necessarily what I would advocate, but why am I so in love with this piece of literature, or this piece of art, or this movie? So
Yeah, that makes
was
sense.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. That's a fun way to come from it too, from your different views and saying, "Hey, this doesn't necessarily support the views that I have, but for some reason I still love it."
Right. And right.
You
And what
know?
does that say? Yeah. And what does that say about me and about all of us, and what we crave? And my former colleague, who's a TV critic for Time, wrote this great piece on romance novels about how romance, like whatever's trendy in romance, is reflecting something that's different from what we're getting in our broader culture. And so she was like, 10 years ago, it was all BDSM and vampires
Right.
and like dangerous romance. And now there are these very normal rom-coms. That's what's trendy. And she's like, because society and broader culture feels more dangerous and threatening
Yeah.
now because of all
Yeah.
the upheaval, right? COVID and politics and everything that's happening. So these very sort of gentle rom-coms have become what people escape into, where it's just
Yeah.
like two people in a small town.
And Sarah, that's where I
Uh,
was going to go, is saying that people nowadays are really looking for an escape from this
right.
reality that we've built for ourselves. That we say, I can't turn on a television without hearing some type of politics or seeing something bad happen around the world. And you're right. Where I think a lot of people right now are looking for ways to escape from their normal reality.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that kind of writing about culture is so interesting to me always.
Yeah, and the fact that our culture changes so frequently and we see different patterns repeat themselves or maybe even new patterns come up, and it's amazing how just the ebbs and flows of our culture, in just this country, and I can't even imagine around the world,
Right. Right.
So in your opinion, how has feminist journalism evolved over the past decade?
So it's almost been absorbed by the mainstream. I think so. There were so many feminist blogs about 15 years ago, 10 years
Mhm.
ago. And then a lot of sort of the alternative sites, websites, web magazines hired some of those bloggers. So it kind of crept from the margins into the mainstream. And now a lot of them
Yeah.
work at places like Time or the New York Times. So they're always going to get a feminist, like if you read any kind of film criticism,
Yeah.
or a movie review of like The Wild Robot or whatever just came out, it's probably going to have, at least there's a good chance there'll be a feminist lens on it. And similarly with like trend pieces and fashion pieces and things like that, because the feminist journalism, the feminist blogosphere, as we used to call it, has sort of come in and influenced everything. But at the same time, I feel that we've lost something because, and this is always true, right? Like this is true of
Yep.
music and like anything that's indie and then goes mainstream. It's like great that that's happened, but then there's also always something creative and subversive that gets lost when you have these indie places that are
Exactly.
working out on
Yeah.
their own.
Because when you have, individual, like you said, we went from a blog phase to kind of going a little bit more mainstream
Right.
nowadays. And what, you're in the blog phase, you're working for yourself. So you write what
Exactly.
you really want. But unfortunately, and, hopefully a lot of the places you've worked at haven't been like this, but the politics does get involved, right? When you start telling stories for another company, they might tell you, hey, you need to tone this down
Tone
or
it down,
you
or you
do
have
something.
a bigger audience, so you
Exactly.
censor yourself. I mean,
Yep.
it's just different. Yeah, it's different when there's sort of a group of people like cooking something up in their living room or
Yeah,
over
exactly.
Zoom, and that's true for any art form, I think.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think the more mainstream it goes, the more pressure you have from, I don't know if it's society or politicians or whatever it may, but there's definitely pressure there to kind of conform to a non-standard norm. I
Right.
call it non-standard because what is normal,
Right,
right?
and you just hope that there's just another generation that's coming up. Like, I was thinking of Greta Gerwig and how she started
Oh
making
yeah.
these super indie movies when she was a film student that definitely had a feminist and, like, just, countercultural, like, kind of weird sensibility, and then she's moved more mainstream. She wants to be a big Hollywood director, and
Yeah.
she's made great movies. I mean, I loved Barbie, I loved Little Women, and I loved that she was able to take her kind of offbeat sensibility and
Hmm.
move it into these big spaces. But then you want to know, like, well, who's the next Greta Gerwig? Like, who's going
Right.
to be inspired by her and make the weird indie movies that we then go see, at the small theater downtown.
Exactly. And so with it going a little bit more mainstream, Sarah, do you think has it helped the feminist movement? Has it hurt it? Is it kind of stagnant? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that we're in a real period of backlash now. I think it's gone so mainstream, and this is true with, Black Lives Matter and a bunch of other
Yeah.
LGBTQ stuff. I think all of it really, there was a really, exciting and awesome moment where all this stuff kind of went mainstream, and everyone was telling their stories about discrimination, and they were being listened to. And I think what's happening right now is just like a really angry backlash to that, and it's
Hmm.
happened before. If you know your feminist history, and this is also true for racial justice and other movements, there's always a period of cultural
Yeah.
backlash. There was a period like after 9/11, there was a period of cultural backlash against feminism. In the 80s, after like the big 70s movement, there was a period of backlash, and you can
Oh yeah.
and so I'm just hopeful that 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 we
And
that
y-
passes as well.
yeah, and what I was going to say, Sarah, is sometimes, we see that backlash when maybe it moves a little bit too fast for what you
Yes.
consider normal, normal folks to get used to, the changes. Because it is a change from some things that would like definitely you would say, I'm sure, Sarah, and I know I would say that the view and the position of, a woman in general has changed just in my lifetime.
Mhm. Mhm.
From when I grew up to where, women were supposed to stay home and take care of
Right.
the kids and
That's
do all that
exactly
stuff.
what I was
And,
gonna say. That's
now it's
changed
like,
completely. Yeah.
yeah, if
Yeah.
my wife and I don't have kids, but if we were, that would definitely be her choice. If you want to stay home, great, that's great. But if you want to work, I'm totally supportive of
Right.
that too, because, well,
Right.
especially nowadays, how can you have a lot of people
Right.
can't live
Everyone
on
just
one
has to
income,
work. Yeah.
you
It's
know,
very interesting. I know.
but it's definitely,
For my
oh
mom, it was
yeah.
very politicized, like whether you worked or stayed home. And now I don't know anybody who can
And
afford to stay home.
And I remember the same thing for my mother. My dad was a police officer, and my mother, just to help make ends meet, was a bus driver to start off, and then she became a janitor. And it's like to see how she really broke into a man's world. And let me tell
Yeah.
you, at that
Wow.
time, a
I'm
janitor was
sure.
from a female was not ever seen. They were all
Yeah.
guys back
That's
then. But
fascinating.
yeah, she
Yeah.
broke into
I'm
that,
sure
but it
she
was
has
because
some stories.
she wanted to take care of her family, and she knew
Yeah.
that she was gonna have to work as much as she wanted to stay home, and she tried to as much as we were when we were little. It just as we got older and got into sports, it cost them more money.
Yeah. And I'm
She's
sure.
like, "I want you guys to have a better life than I did, and so this is what I'm willing to do for you." And I just thought it was amazing. So, Mom, if
Yeah.
you're listening, I
All
love you for everything that you've done and everything you've been through
And
just to give
the
us a normal
benefit
life.
for you was that you got to see a woman in a man's you got to see her as a
Yeah.
role model, this woman in a man's world, and
And I saw
it
all the
probably
different,
and if
all
you
the adversity she's had in that
exactly.
field was just
And then in your whole life, when you encounter women in the workplace, it's normalized for you because
absolutely. And
you have your
it is,
mom.
and it's
Right.
but some other people it's not,
Right,
So it's like for
exactly.
me, like when I was in a management position, I always look to, and I'm not trying to get into the DEI thing with what our current president and everything is going through, but I always look for the best person for the job. And I have actually, believe it or not, traditionally worked in more female dominant roles, especially in my later life. I worked at I managed an appointment center for a children's hospital, and most of the employees were female. And I was one of I think there was 3 males in the entire department of like 372 people. So it was, it was a different thing for me. So I understand what it is going back and forth and being, a minority in a certain aspect there,
Yeah, and I think
but
that's probably was a healthy experience for you.
it was extremely healthy for me. And I
Yeah.
just, the great thing is that I just love human beings in general, and to me, regardless of color, sex, creed, sexual orientation, I don't care. I can get along with anybody, and I love everybody. And I just want to make sure, the biggest thing is if you're happy, I'm happy.
Exactly.
That's all that matters
That's
to
how
me.
I explain feminism to my kids. I'm like, my feminism is the belief that gender shouldn't hold you back from pursuing
Yes.
your dreams. Whatever gender you are and whatever your dreams are, they should all be accessible to you. So if you're a guy
Yep.
who wants to be a nurse,
Absolutely.
that's feminism too.
Yeah.
Or you want to be a father who stays home with your kids. That's that's feminism too, or takes an interest in what your kids are wearing and helps buy the clothes or whatever. I think that, breaking down those roles so we can all kind of be more free
Yes.
is what it's all about.
Exactly. Yeah, we shouldn't have gender roles really anymore.
Right.
I mean,
I
there's
have
certain
a
things
sticker
that
that
a
says
mother can
cinnamon
do
rolls. Yeah, not
Exactly.
gender roles.
There's definitely things that a mother can
Yes.
do that a father can't do, right?
Right.
But in
But
most
beyond
parts,
that, yeah.
yes. In the working world
Yeah.
and the regular world,
Yeah.
I'm 100% with you,
Yeah.
regardless of anything that you have. As long as you can do the job or, just be a decent human being, I'm all for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So excellent. Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a
No,
tangent
I think
there,
that's
but
really interesting. It's
yeah.
very interesting.
And so, like for you, and I know you've written on subjects like Hollywood casting, abortion rights, literary critiques. What have been some of your challenges and triumphs in covering subjects like that?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think a triumph for me always is when I get when there's sort of a smooth process where I get an idea, I'll see a TV show, an episode of a TV show and be like, oh, this is a trend. I've seen 3 other things like this. It's an idea. And then I pitch it to somebody and they accept it and it gets and sort of the whole thing works smoothly. And then, the challenge is always, particularly if you're a freelance, coming up with the right idea at the right time. So there have been many times when I've had really good ideas and I've tried to pitch them and they just either, you pitch a magazine and they have somebody in-house who's already covering it, someone on staff, or, they don't have the budget because it's the end of the year. So coming up against rejection or, the bad timing and stuff. I think that when I was
say timing has to be a huge thing
it's
too,
a huge
right?
thing. And now I have a really thick skin and I just sort of tell my students, I'm like, just submit, who cares, but I remember that when I was in my early 20s, how hard it all was and how it's hard for it not to seem personal. It's only experience that makes you realize that it's really, and being on the other side, being an editor and knowing that sometimes I turn things down because I literally just don't have the time to edit something that has a lot of potential, but I'm like, this would take 3 hours to edit and I just don't have 3 hours this week. So I can't do it, but but it's a good idea and the writer's talented. There's nothing wrong with it. Yeah, it just doesn't fit in with my schedule. So
yeah, that's so tough. That's going to be tough on your part too, to sit there and say, oh man, this is great, but I need to put a little bit more time in it. And it's like, but I don't have the time,
Right.
I can see how that would be.
Sometimes I do have the time. A lot of it is timing. So then
it is.
When you're on the other side, I tell my students, I'm like, they're like, you just really, so much of it is luck and what you can't believe, you can't believe that it's all your idea or your talent.
Exactly.
There's just so much else at play.
Yeah. And then, so for you, Sarah, when you've written a lot of articles, and I know we're going to get into your book here shortly, but and so we're kind of building up to that. But for you, how do you integrate? I know a lot of writers integrate personal experience into their writing, especially in topics that are important to them. So how do you integrate personal experiences into your writing?
I love to include a little anecdote or personal story in some of my more essayistic or critical pieces, if I can, in the Times, I wrote a New York Times op-ed about department stores. Actually, it was really random. I had done another piece, a longer reported piece for Lilith about sort of how shopping culture has changed and how it used to be a social thing.
Yeah.
going shopping, like you would spend the day, you would go with
Yeah, I
a
mean, we
a
used to
friend, do
hang
all
out
your
at the
errands.
mall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, that kind of stuff, and then I ended up talking with an editor at the Times, and we wrote specifically about Lord & Taylor closing in New York City and how department stores used to be like something called a third space, where you would go and go to different departments and get your housewares on sale, and then your kids' clothes. Then you would go have lunch at the in-house restaurant, and it
Yep.
was this whole experience. It was like a special treat for people. And for people from all socioeconomic backgrounds, actually, because different department stores cater to
Yeah,
different clientele,
exactly.
but it was a treat for everyone. And so I talked about going to Lord & Taylor with my mom and my grandma, and going to the makeup counter and trying on a lipstick, and then having lunch
Yep.
together. It was one of the most, of all the pieces I've written, the comment section was one of my favorite comment sections that I've ever read, because everyone who was reading that article just told their own department store stories, and and it was like it was people from rural areas and people from urban areas and people who remembered going to discount department stores, and there was just
Yep.
it really brought out a lot of stories. And just the reason I sometimes bring in personal stories is because then it inspires other people to respond with their stories.
Absolutely. And you
um
almost build a community with it, right? If you
exactly.
bring your own, and then it puts yourself out there too, so people know, hey, who is Sarah? Well, guess what? We see who Sarah is because we see it in her writing.
Right, I think I tend to not be a really deeply personal essay writer. Like, I know people who write confessional pieces about their addiction or their whatever, family secrets, and I don't
Mhm.
have a lot of dark secrets
Well, that's a good
to
thing. There's
write
nothing
about.
wrong
I
with
mean, I
that.
have everyone has problems, and I have plenty of bad things that have happened, but that's not my mode of writing. But I do like to I do think that telling little stories, and we all have little stories in our lives that other people can relate to. And I think it's really important. And, it helps ground exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
It helps people see the person who's writing the piece as a real person.
Yep. Exactly. And that's where I think, most of the writing that I find myself involved in, number one, it has to be something that interests me. But number two, when I can see the writer and what they're writing, it really helps because you kind of feel that connection, as a reader/writer connection,
Right. All right. And
you know?
it's a special connection too,
Yeah.
because you're just looking at shapes on a page.
Exactly. It's hard to do just, especially when we get like we talk about your novel and, I remember when we had books as a kid, we had pictures, right? But when we get
Yeah.
older, you have to
You
make
have to
your own
make the
pictures in your
picture.
mind.
Exactly.
Exactly. So, and then with the writing process, is there a specific process that you follow with writing? And is that different? Was it different for your normal journalistic type writings versus your novel?
It's pretty similar for me for all my writing, which is that I tend to be someone who dumps all my thoughts out in sort of a very messy first draft, and then refines and refines and refines like crazy. Whereas I know even my husband and other people that I'm close to will be much more like want every paragraph to make a lot of sense before they move on to the next one. So there's all kinds of variations in between. But I'm someone who has to have a whole bunch of stuff on the page to work with before I can really start thinking about the structure and the organization. I have to just get my thoughts out. So I've just
Nice.
become really comfortable with accepting that that's how I write things. And I think what I used to do more was like give people my first drafts to read, and now I've really come to realize that, like, no, that draft is for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody else needs to read it. I just need to have it, and then I can start sending to people around like the third draft.
Yeah. And that makes, it's funny. Like I said, I've talked to other authors and it's kind of I hear the same thing. Like the first few drafts are personal and
Yeah,
then they start sending them out for
exactly.
feedback.
Exactly. I heard someone sometimes even talk about a zero draft, which I love that idea, where it's like before it's even the first draft.
Yeah,
'Cause it's
exactly.
like so
Like a
messy, it
super
might
rough
have you
draft.
right, super rough, super rough.
Yep.
Might even have like notes to yourself in it, where it's like put scene in here.
Yep, exactly. And do you find it hard at all for yourself, especially, when we go to your journalistic writing, to balance your personal narrative with the broader cultural commentary?
Sometime, I mean, it kind of depends. I think when I was younger, I found it very easy. I think now that I'm a parent of young kids, I sometimes feel a little isolated.
Hmm.
My personal everyday life
His
is very
kids.
yeah, it's just kid stuff, exactly. So sometimes writing about adult things requires more of a leap.
Yeah.
But in general, I think that's something that I can, that's something like a specialty that I have, is being able to like see a personal anecdote and like
Yeah.
extrapolate onto something bigger.
Yep. That's pretty cool though that,
Yeah.
you could go from that being a mom to go into being a writer and wear those multiple hats to just keep moving on forward. I can't I don't have children, but I work with a lot of folks that do have kids, and I can see how that, they can definitely how kids can distract you from your work.
They can. I remember that when it's funny, 'cause I have a colleague who's coming back from maternity leave on Monday, and I just left her a note for when she comes into the office, 'cause I know it's gonna be really, like, traumatic. But I also remember how amazing it felt when I first got back from my first maternity leave,
Mhm.
and I was working at a startup, internet website, a really cool culture website. It was, like, downtown New York City. Remember, like, being at my desk in the open office. We had an open office, of course,
Yeah.
for the first time, and, like, starting to write a piece and being like, "Oh, right, I can do this. Like, this is my thing," and how good it felt to be like, "I'm not just a mom, I'm not just someone who changes diapers."
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're a writer and you're an author, and now we've got your debut novel, The Singer Sisters. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about the? Obviously, I don't want you to give the book away because I want our listeners to go and actually buy it and read it. But do you want to give us a little bit of, overall arc of what The Singer Sisters is about?
Yes, so The Singer Sisters is a rock and roll family novel. It's about two generations in one family in the 1960s and the 1990s mostly, although it goes to other decades too, and they're all singers, songwriters, and performers. So the idea that came to me was, I saw a family of folk singers performing at some point, and the idea just lodged in my head, like, what if your family business was, you know, rather than being a real estate agent or owning a
Yeah,
store, what if it was art, making music, and what if people were, making music in one family for each other? Like, some of the
yeah.
songs in the book are lullabies that the parents write for the children, and, like, angry songs that the children write about the parents. Um, so that was the idea. It was a family that expresses themselves through song and sort of their story through the years and how it interweaves with the music that they make. And so there's sort of the personal story of their own relationships and their secrets and their betrayals and, their
Right.
rivalries, but also the story of their music. And as some of them have big hits and then they fall off the charts and they, put music aside for a while and they retire and they come out of retirement. So those stories are woven together basically. And it's at its heart, there's dads and brothers and aunts, but the two main characters are a mother and daughter who are both very stubborn, very ambitious singers and are a bit different. The mother is an introspective folk singer and the daughter is a loud rock singer, but
Gotcha.
they
Different spectrums for sure.
exactly, but they both are very determined and they have to figure out how to accept each other. And that's sort of the overarching story.
And that's great because, I think that's a story that quite often most of us have had in our life. How do we get along with a parent or, a sibling or any family member,
Mhm.
really? How do we understand each other? Because even though we're similar, we come from the same bloodline, we're different, right?
Right, exactly. The similarities and the differences, and also not always being able to see the ways that you're similar.
Exactly, exactly. Now, for this book, what inspired you to tell a story of a folk rock family, especially across generations?
So it was this sort of initial spark was this family. The McGarrigle sisters were a Canadian folk act from the 60s and 70s, and and Kate McGarrigle has two kids, Rufus Wainwright and Martha Wainwright, who are both kind of more alternative rock pop kind of singers who were really big when I was a teenager in the 90s. And their family structure was kind of the initial inspiration, but the other sort of bigger inspiration for me is being a child of the 90s myself and being fascinated by the 60s and the pop culture of the 60s and my parents' record collection and
Yeah.
thinking about the ways that generations borrow from their parents' pop culture and then also rebel against it. I
Hmm.
think is what was the deeper inspiration, because that had been something I've been thinking about for a long, long time, thinking about how all the music, it was so fascinating to me that all the music that was really popular when I was a teenager was all calling back to the music that had been popular when my parents were teenagers.
No,
Like,
you're
there was,
absolutely
like,
right. Yeah.
Oasis dressing like the Beatles,
That was exactly what I was thinking about, Oasis and the Beatles.
Yeah,
There was so
exactly.
much comparison between those 2 groups
Right.
that
I
you're
mean,
like, "Wow, this is like the new I used to call it, "Oh, this is the Beatles of the '90s."
yeah, they were so, I mean, the first time I saw them on MTV, I was like, "Why are they dressed like the Beatles?"
Exactly.
But I was like, "Well, that makes sense because I am also obsessed with the Beatles." And, because I was 13 years old and I had just discovered the Beatles. And then, you had, like, Adam Duritz from the Counting Crows, like singing about how he wanted to be like Bob Dylan. And then it was just,
Yep.
it was like everywhere. It was like this.
You're like naming all the bands that I just
Yeah,
loved growing up.
totally.
Like I've seen so many Counting Crows concerts. It's just ridiculous.
I
I used to
love-
travel
yeah.
with my friends, and because it was just a nice laid back, folky, poppy kind of, sound. And I just loved it. But it's so
Yeah.
funny to hear you bring these bands up, because these are all bands that I liked when I was
Yeah.
younger in the 90s too.
Yeah, right. I mean, they were so big, and they were all calling back. They were all very much enamored with the music of the 60s, and I was into both of them. So that is really, I mean, pop culturally, that's what's behind the book, because there's this, it's about his music and 60s music and their interaction in the form of his daughter and a 60s mother, and their relationship kind of embodies some of that, where the daughter really wants to make her mark and be different. And she also kind of understands that her mom is a legend and a really great songwriter, and that she's never, like, there's no way, because in the 60s they were inventing this form. They were inventing pop music.
Really, yeah.
So it's kind of impossible to eclipse it. And so that's what she kind of has to reckon with, was her, her mom's genius, and also her mom's whole generation's genius.
Yeah, like her legacy even,
Exactly.
and,
Her
and
legacy.
to go, because how do you go upon that? If your mom's like this famous 60s, rocker or, folk song
Folky, yeah.
person, that is, been out there, everybody knows it. And now you've got that to live up to, right? You have to, now everybody's like, oh, what is this person going to do? And are they going to be better?
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's a tough that would be tough for anybody to live up to.
Yeah, I mean, poor Jacob Dylan, he still gets questions about his dad, whenever he has a new project.
Yep. And it's like,
he's very gracious about it. But yeah, so I think that was really interesting to me. I mean, I remember being really interested in Jacob Dylan and his dad and all that stuff. So that's all kind of threaded into the book as well.
Yeah, and are there any particular themes that we would see throughout the book?
So there's the theme of, I mean, the sort of biggest theme is, everyone in the family has a calling towards art, right? Or everyone in the family that's covered in the book. I mean, there is a main character in the book who ends up not going into music, and her story is important too. But most of the characters feel that music is their thing and it's their calling, and that contrasts and sometimes clashes with their relationships with each other and their sort of duty to their family and their friends.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of the theme that goes through the generations in the movie. Like, what do we owe our audience and our legacy? If we have talent, is it our duty to share our talent with the world, or is it more important to be kind and to be present and not go on tour and be there with our kids and right the wrong?
Yeah.
Yep. And so they all feel that conflict in different ways over time.
Yeah, that's pretty impactful too, because I think, you could see that theme with any family, really.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
They don't have to be a famous musical family, but you can see it.
Your call doesn't have to be a musician. It has to be, maybe it's like, being on your, you're being on your community board, or being a custodian at the school. Like, maybe that's, where you feel like you have your job and that's really important. Then you also have your kids, and or maybe it's, your garden. I mean, everyone has things that, their greater work, and they also have their domestic work. And whether that's, even if they don't have children, right? It could be taking care of their parents or taking care of their neighbors. Yep. And so we all kind of have both of those things in our lives. And so sometimes they work together in harmony, and sometimes there's a conflict between them. And so that's what the book really explores, what we owe each other and what we owe the greater world, I would say.
And then, Sarah, in your novel, is there any specific part of the book that you loved the most to write? Was there anything in there that, if our readers get to that point, you're like, this was one of my favorite parts that that I'd love you to read, and definitely want you to, see in the book?
So my favorite parts to write was all the music stuff, although I'm not an expert, but I loved writing. I wrote lyrics for a lot of the songs.
Nice.
Yeah, which was really, really fun. And I also loved writing the concert scenes. Again, I've never really been on stage and played music. It was so fun to kind of choreograph the concert scenes. And in both, I think what both of those have in common was like trying to tell the story through the medium of a concert scene. So like maybe two characters are having a conflict with each other while they're on stage together. And like, well, how does that reflect in the way the music is played and the way they interact with the audience? And similarly with the lyrics.
That's awesome. I like that, because they're going to have this interaction, and then they're going to go out, and the music's probably going to be a little different. Like if you're angry, I'm sure you might strum the guitar a little bit harder or whatever it may be.
Exactly.
That's
And there's
awesome. I like that.
there's that clip that goes around. I mean, for me, at least on my feed, it comes around on the internet for me like every week of Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham like singing a song, Fleetwood Mac song, and like staring really angrily and like passionately at each other. And I was like,
Yes.
oh my God, like what is going on between them? And she's singing Silver Springs.
Yeah, exactly.
Because right, everyone wants to know like what it, and so that part was really fun. And similarly with the lyrics, in the same way we're always trying to decode like what boyfriend Taylor Swift is writing about, and in which song, like the characters are expressing their feelings about each other through their lyrics.
Yeah.
So trying to have lyrics that sounded decent as lyrics, but also were advancing the plot of the novel. That was really fun, for me.
But
Both of those were really fun.
And you took another avenue, right, that you weren't used to doing, writing lyrics.
Exactly. You're right. That's
and you
exactly
did it again,
right.
which is there comes that skill again.
Right.
Right?
Trying
I love that.
something
That's
new.
amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that you're
Yeah, it
not
was very
just,
fun.
doing something new, putting yourself out there, trying new lyrics. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And it's great that our listeners could come in and read the Singer Sisters and see that. That's what I love getting, what's your favorite part? Because then, it brings the listeners will look out for that. So I love that.
Well, thank you. I say that most people have really responded really, really well to the lyrics. They think that's a fun part of the book. So
that was my next question.
Yeah.
How has the reception of the book been so far?
The reception has been really good. I mean, it's definitely the people who I think have responded like the strongest to it, or the people who have been moved to email me, and come to me are both parents and people who have caregiving roles in their lives because of exactly what we were just talking about. They feel the book really captured that inner conflict between taking care of someone, whether it's a parent or a child,
Yeah.
and whatever else you have to do in the world. That really spoke to them. And then people who love music, have obviously really, I've gotten a lot of guys who like are, music fans like yourself, who kind of been like, oh, I kind of like, you got me to read a novel about a mother and daughter, and I really liked it because of all the music stuff. So that's also been a fun response. Yeah.
It's nice. You kind of like bridged a gap there.
Yeah, I think,
right?
I
That
hope
maybe
so.
someone wouldn't have looked at, but because the music was in there, now you brought in someone to, see a story of a mother and daughter.
Yeah.
But you brought them there through music, which is great.
There was a great review. There was like an Australian, I don't remember what it's called, an Australian music website where one of their music critics was like, well, I picked up this book and it was a little more of a chick book than I expected, but I actually was really hooked because the music stuff was really fun. So this is my dream. This is exactly what I'm hoping for.
That's great because, if that's what you're hoping for and getting out of it and you got that, that's amazing. A lot of people don't get that satisfaction, So that's great. And Sarah, where can our listeners go to get your book?
It's available all the sites. So Bookshop, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. And it is, my preference, of course, that you go to your local indie bookstore and, make friends with the booksellers there and buy it there. At least at the beginning, when the book came out, it was the little bookstores gave it a lot of love. And it was, my friends were sending pictures of the book from all around the country, from, it came out in August. So from various, the shores of Lake Michigan and the, Rehoboth Beach and Palm Springs, all these great summer vacation destinations. They were like, well, look, your book is in the bookstore here. So it is in most bookstores, but it's also available everywhere online. And the paperback comes out this summer. And there's also an audiobook that people really, people who like audiobooks have really enjoyed because it has 3 different narrators. So
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it gives you a nice little breakup from just having one person read the book all the time.
Yeah, and they're all really cool.
Yeah.
In my opinion. I've only just started listening to audiobooks myself, but
I've listened to a couple.
Yeah.
I'm kind of, I don't know how you are, but there's just something still about having a nice piece of, a paper book in your hand and just reading it. I'm old school like that, I guess.
I prefer the paper book, but I also, I do read ebooks on my phone and listen to audiobooks
I do the same thing. Yeah.
Because just for it's just nice. I always have to
just
try to have one library book on my phone. Exactly. For when I've forgotten the paperback, and the audiobook I like listening to when I'm doing the dishes or something. But yes, paperback or hardcover remains my favorite way to read.
Awesome. So Sarah, we've talked about your book, but are there, what type of books do you generally like to read if you're going to, just for personal preference?
So I read, it might not surprise you after talking to me about what I write, that I also read really widely. I really enjoy, so I read everything from, well, not so much recently, but I do love reading more classic novels from like the 19th century and the early 20th century. I read more highly literary novels that have, won prizes or are published by small presses. And I also love to read. I try to read the big popular novels of every year. So I'm about to read like the new Sally Rooney book I just borrowed from my dad. My parents are huge readers.
Oh, good. So we
Even
know
more
where it
than
came
I
from,
am.
right?
So I go to their apartment sometimes and just grab. They always have like the hot new book. So I grab. I have more than I do. So I grab those. And my husband reads science fiction. I read romance novels on my phone. So it really varies. I mean, but my favorite genre to read is what I write, which is sort of accessible, like I would say like friendly. So like somewhere in between commercial and literary fiction. That's easy to read, but has some literary value and, hits bigger, deeper themes.
Yep, and that's some of my
Yeah.
favorite things to read as well. Something that's, a nice, easy read, but really hits a good topic,
Exactly.
or hits something there.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, so for your book, for the Singer Sisters, is there a particular message that you're trying to get across to readers within the book, or something that they should look out for?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I try to not have to let readers draw their own conclusion.
I love
For
that.
instance, the question Judy is the mother character who was a big, a folk genius in the 60s and then gave up music for a long time. And sort of the question of whether she made the right choices over her life is, she doesn't know by the end. She kind of comes to the conclusion that like, well, I may not have made choices, but those are my choices. And now I'm here and I have to kind of make the most of it. But yeah, and her kids are asking themselves the same question, like, should my mom have had me, or should she have just devoted herself to her art? And I think that for most of us, we don't know, our own roads not taken, right? We don't know. I sometimes wonder, like, well, what would life have been like if I had just traveled in my 20s and not come back to New York and not, I just, but we'll never know, right? And so
because you have to assume it would be different, right?
Yeah, right. Or you might have ended up in the same spot. So you can't say. And I think that's, I think one of the reviewers was saying, like, one reviewer who I thought really got the book was like, well, that's what the book sort of describes. The Singer Sisters describes, all the mistakes that one person can make over the course of life, but also like that's life. Like that's the beauty of it, is that you kind of make mistakes and then you try to correct them if you're a decent person, and you have to move on into the next mistake.
Yeah. I mean, really, yeah, because we're all kind of learning as we go along this thing in life, and who we are today is probably not even who we were yesterday in most points.
Exactly.
But we learn as we go. We learn, those mistakes happen. Hopefully we learn from them and can move forward and not make them again. But yeah, that's still a great message though, to hear.
Yeah, and
this mom, right, that has put her career and
Right.
has kids. It's like we kind of talked about earlier.
Right.
How do you find that balance?
Right, and that would she have been a better mom if she had been more fulfilled as an artist? Like that's one of the questions that her kids have, and it's just not clear. We all make choices for different reasons. So I think part of if there is a message, is that they all have to kind of come to understand each other's choices and accept that, because I think in your family, right, you also often want to not control, but like you want to help make decisions for your family members for them because you think
Right.
what's right for them, and
Exactly.
or what
You're
would have
gonna
been right
offer
for them.
unsolicited advice,
And
right?
there is a level at which you have to let people make their own mistakes, and that's how people learn. And so acceptance and forgiveness, is definitely like that's. I mean, some people have said that that's what the end of the novel is about, forgiveness and
I love that.
making amends. Yeah.
And that's
In
really
a
a story
quiet
we
way.
need.
Yeah.
We need
Yeah.
right now, because I
Yes.
know there are a lot of people out there that will struggle with, maybe how their parents were while they grew up, and,
Yeah.
maybe they didn't pay enough attention to them or whatever it may be because of their career or because of something else. And
Right.
it's nice to see that you wrote about this, even though it's a fictional book. It's something
Right.
that we can relate to and hopefully
Yes.
learn something from, even whether we're a mom or a daughter, we can look at it and say, here's some things that happen. Maybe I can avoid those mistakes with my child, or maybe I can avoid those mistakes and maybe understand better what my parents were going through.
Right. And I think also so much of the book is Emma is so reactive to her mom. Like she's trying to react against her mom, but by doing that, she's kind of letting her, like she's letting her mom's choices define her own life too. And I think you have to, part of correcting mistakes is also accepting them. Like you,
Yes.
if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
I
I
mean,
think,
unfortunately, we can't change the
right,
past, so we
right,
have to accept it and
right.
learn from it and move forward.
Or even what I say to my kids is like, if you're reacting so strongly against like something that your friend or your teacher does, you're actually still letting that control you in a
Yep.
way, right?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah,
if you
exactly.
can't, and if you can put your anger aside, you can find a way to kind of move away from it. But that is a really hard lesson to learn. I mean, it's a hard lesson for
So hard.
grown-ups to learn.
Exactly. I can't even,
You
thinking back to a kid, how
we
hard
all
that
have
is.
to
Yeah.
probably be learning that for our whole lives.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So, Sarah, what do you have in the pipeline? Any more novels or articles or any new areas of journalism that you're going to be exploring here in the near future?
That is a really great question. I'm just trying to start with the journalistic writing again a little bit. I mean, not not that I ever really stopped, but I have been focused on promoting the book a lot in the last year or so. So I am trying to do a little writing just for Lilith where I work. And like for instance, I'm going to do a little profile of another novelist who wrote a book about rock and roll, and that I interviewed her. That was really fun.
Nice.
Write up a little profile about that, and it's just some things like that, just to get back into it. And I do
Yeah.
have some fiction on in the hopper, but it's still early days for that. So, but
Yeah.
I'm excited. I'm excited
But we
to
could
get back
definitely
to it.
expect to see more from you in the future for sure.
You can at some point.
Yeah, if we've
This
seen
one
all
took
this from
7
you to
years,
this
so
point, if
yeah,
we've seen all
yeah.
this from you at this point, I'm sure we're going to see plenty more from Sarah in the future here. Excellent. So, for you, do you have any tips for those that are looking to break into journalism? I mean, you have such an expansive background and have worked for some of the biggest, journalistic companies and written your own novel, so any tips that you could give to anybody out there that may be looking to break into journalism?
It's a difficult moment to break into journalism sort of in the traditional way, but there is so much going on. If you can find out what's happening in your own town or your own neighborhood, right? Because like for instance, I just learned that there's some of these big national fights are happening like in the community school districts, like in New York City.
Oh, wow.
There's people from different factions are clashing at me, and I'm like, wow, like there's always room checking out what's happening around you and writing about it, even if it's just for your Instagram feed or your Blue Sky at the moment, and just
Yeah.
writing about it in a really clear way, getting attention that way, and practicing kind of telling the stories that you see in a way that can help people understand them. And then, from that you can build into a newsletter or pitch your local, if is still a local newspaper.
Right.
I know I couldn't recommend it more. Despite coming, I come from New York City, and now there aren't as many local papers, but I actually, when I first got out of college and I was tutoring and I was doing a little bit of everything, but I did actually do news reporting for like neighborhood papers in Manhattan. There were neighborhood papers. So I'd be like, this restaurant, like the workers are on strike. And I'm going to go, like literally would take my reporter's notebook and go down and like talk to the workers on the picket line or to the people fighting at the school board meeting and write an article and do sort of like the very classic local
Yeah.
journalist thing. And I think that is the best training you can possibly get.
And I'll tell you what, you
So-
mentioned that, and I'm just going to go down memory road again, but we used to have a paper here where I live. I live in a place called Talmadge, Ohio, and it was called the Talmadge Express. And I used to I read some of the best articles in that little newspaper that was free, that showed up in my mailbox
these
every
were free
Sunday.
newspapers too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, I read some of those and now it's gone,
Yeah, I
because
know.
they don't put anything
There's
in print
been-
anymore.
I know. It's actually like,
It's
that's
digital,
a whole
right?
other
Yeah.
discussion of what's going on in our country. But I think that's been a huge loss because,
It
right,
has
there
been.
are all these local stories that actually have national significance and that we're not getting the right coverage on. So, and local papers are gems. And they're also
They
just
are,
like
and-
full of great human stories.
They are, and
So-
just and local stuff too that really
Yeah.
that you can relate to because it's
Right.
right there in your neighborhood.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
great advice for our listeners that, if they want to break into journalism, to find those local things and, the local newspaper, if you have one, do a little article for it. Like you said,
Right, or
just write on Instagram
There might be a
and put it out
right.
there.
Yeah, and there might be if there's not a local newspaper, there might be a website that covers. I mean, now in New York, there are a lot of these websites that cover different neighborhoods that do take submissions. So
Yeah, that's great advice. And, so thank you for that. Cause I know we have a lot of listeners that do like to write, and they, some of my interviews with authors are the most popular. So
that's great.
Yeah,
and if people are interested in other kinds of creative writing, I would just also really recommend taking a class, at your local, I love creative writing classes. And I took them even after I had a master's in fine arts, like I took local classes, and I even took a class to help me write this book. Like I helped, it was like a class that helped you generate a manuscript with a group of, and it was,
Yeah.
so I just couldn't recommend, like, because writing is very solitary. So find your community and write with friends
Yeah,
if you can.
excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that advice there.
Yeah.
That's great for everybody. Is there anything else that you want the listeners to be aware of or know about?
I mean, I think that I will, we are living in a really fragmented time in our country. And I just would, say, like, I hope that art, whether it's novels or films or pieces of journalism, short stories, essays, TV shows, like that you go into experiencing art with an open mind and let it open your empathy. Let it open your heart. Let it open your heart towards people who may have made different choices than you in life and have different experiences. Because I think there are actually studies that show that reading fiction can increase people's empathy. So I think, don't be afraid. I do this all the time. Like, watch movies and read books that challenge you and challenge your worldview. And sometimes it's easier to do that through art than it is to do it through reading an op-ed that you disagree with. So
That's solid advice.
Yeah, why not, right?
You're absolutely right. You should go into artwork with an open mind, regardless of what it is and whatever the medium. That's one of the things with, I think, the problems with our country right now, Sarah, is that we're just too divided, and it's like you're either with me or against me, and it's like that's not the way we should be.
Right.
I mean, especially in the political, who cares about the political stuff? Because most of the time, especially at the federal level, it doesn't really affect us locally, what they do. But what I mean by that is we need to get back together because we have so much more in common than what separates us. And I think as a country, we should embrace our humanity and get back to just looking at each other as human beings.
Yes. Being decent to each other and kind to each other and listening to each other is what we need,
and
for sure.
Get out there and experience new things that push you to your limits.
Yeah.
Because that's only going to make you a better person. Whether you agree with it or not at the end, having a knowledge and understanding where people come from, regardless of their background, is only going to help you to be a more well-rounded individual. I
think you're so right. And I do think you're right. The part of what's happened on the internet has allowed us to all be in our bubbles.
Yeah. And, we don't have that. We don't have that like you and I when we were growing up in the 90s. If you wanted to say something bad about somebody, you had to say it to their face.
Right. And, exactly. No, I think
when
it
you're
makes
not standing there in front of you have a,
it makes a difference.
You get a little more courage that you probably wouldn't have in person.
Yeah.
So, always think about that when you post on, anybody posts on
things. Think before you post.
Exactly. It
took me a long time to learn that.
Yes. No, me too. I
know.
And then you're like, wait. Hold on.
Yeah, right.
Wait a second.
Don't press post yet.
No, excellent. Sarah, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I loved hearing about the book and hearing about your writing and just all of your thought process and what our listeners are going to get from this. And, again, your book is called The Singer Sisters, and it's available anywhere the books are sold. You could get it online through Amazon. And Sarah, I believe you have a website too, don't you?
Yeah, so you can just go, you can go to thesingersisters.com or Sarah M. Seltzer, Sarah with an H, SarahMSeltzer.com, or just Google Sarah Seltzer and you'll find me.
Yep.
You'll
excellent.
Find the site.
That wraps up another thought-provoking episode of Just a Dude podcast. I want to thank Sarah Seltzer for sharing her insights, her experiences, and her passion for feminist journalism and storytelling. From dissecting cultural phenomena to creating compelling narratives in The Singer Sisters, Sarah has truly enriched our understanding of the stories that really matter. If you're inspired by today's conversation, be sure to check out Sarah's work at sarahseltzer.wordpress.com. And don't forget to pick up The Singer Sisters for an even deeper dive into her world. Remember, if you enjoy what you heard, subscribe to Just a Dude podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to leave us a review and share this episode for someone who needs to hear it. Join us next time as we continue to explore the minds shaping our world. I'm Nathan, your host, saying thanks for listening, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep being just a dude or a dudette in this complex world of ours.